At 0847 hours on December 20th, 1944, Staff Sergeant Carl Hübner crouched behind his M157mm anti-tank gun at a snow-covered crossroads near Werbermont, Belgium. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Frost coated every metal surface. His breath condensed in small clouds that hung in the still morning air before dissipating. 8 Panther tanks were visible through the morning fog at 1,200 yards, maybe more behind them. Hübner couldn't be certain. The fog reduced visibility to intermittent glimpses, dark shapes moving through white haze, diesel exhaust marking their positions like smoke signals. The smell of their engines reached him first, that distinctive petroleum stink of German tanks. Different from American fuel. Sharper. Then came the mechanical sounds. Metal treads on frozen ground. The hydraulic whine of turret traverse motors. Hull hatches clanging shut as tank commanders buttoned up for combat. Hübner's hands rested on the elevation wheel of his gun. His right hand specifically. The wheel controlled the barrel's vertical angle. Standard doctrine said keep it at 0 to 5 degrees. Flat trajectory. Center mass. Aiming. That's what Field Manual 6 to 75 prescribed. That's what every instructor at Fort Sill had drilled into him. But Hübner was about to spin that wheel 12 full rotations. He was about to elevate the barrel to 15 degrees maximum elevation. He was about to violate a direct order embedded in Army doctrine. The manual explicitly forbade what he was planning. Maximum elevation was for indirect fire only, for lobbing shells over hills at targets you couldn't see. Using it for direct fire against armor was prohibited, dangerous, ineffective. Grounds for court-martial, if it failed. His crew watched him. Corporal James Decker stood at the loader's position, one hand on a 57mm armor-piercing round, waiting. Decker was 22, from Ohio, had loaded over 300 rounds in combat. He knew when something felt wrong, and this felt wrong. Private First Class Robert Chen manned the ammunition handler position, kneeling beside 6 more rounds arranged on a canvas tarp. Chen was 20. From California. His brother had died at Kasserine Pass in 1943. Following doctrine, Chen had told Hübner that story once, just once. Neither man mentioned it again. The tension was palpable, unspoken. Follow doctrine and die, or break the rules and maybe survive. Those were the options. 6 days of combat in the Ardennes had proven that standard tactics didn't work against Panthers. 6 days of watching American gun crews get slaughtered while following the manual. 6 days of funeral details and empty positions. Hübner looked at his men. Then he looked at the approaching tanks. Then he looked at the elevation wheel under his hand. In the next 14 minutes, everything would change. December 16th through December 22nd, 1944. 6 days of systematic failure. The 82nd Airborne Division lost 23 M157mm anti-tank guns during that period. 23 guns destroyed. 67 American gunners killed. All of them following standard doctrine. All of them doing exactly what the manual said to do. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. American gun crew identifies German armor. American crew positions gun per Field Manual 6 to 75. American crew engages at prescribed range with prescribed elevation. American round bounces off German frontal armor. German tank closes distance. German tank destroys American position. American gun crew dies or retreats. The pattern never changed, only the names changed. Incident. One occurred on December 17th, 1944, near Mannheim. Sergeant Thomas Morrison commanded a 4-man gun crew. Morrison was 31 years old, regular Army, 9 years of service. He'd trained at Fort Sill in 1940, when the M157mm was brand new. He knew that gun inside and out. He followed doctrine perfectly. At 1,420 hours, Morrison's crew identified a Panther tank at 600 yards. Perfect engagement range according to the manual. Morrison ordered his crew to prepare for action. His loader, Corporal Stevens, chambered an M86 armor-piercing round. The breech closed with a metallic snap. Morrison aimed center mass on the Panther's frontal armor. Standard targeting. He elevated the barrel to 3 degrees. Standard elevation. He compensated for range and the slight crosswind. Textbook procedure. Then he fired. The gun bucked. The round streaked downrange at 2,800 feet per second. Flight time, approximately 0.65 seconds. The crew watched through binoculars as the projectile struck the Panther's lower glacis plate. A bright spark marked the impact point. Then the round tumbled skyward. Deflection angle, approximately 12 degrees from the armor surface. No penetration. The Panther was undamaged. The German tank commander responded immediately. Instead of retreating, he advanced. The Panther closed from 600 yards to 500 yards, then 400 yards, then 300 yards. Morrison's crew fired twice more during the approach. Both rounds ricocheted. The mathematical reality was inescapable. The M157mm could not penetrate Panther frontal armor at any range using standard doctrine. At 250 yards, the Panther stopped. Its turret traversed toward Morrison's position. The 75mm main gun elevated slightly. Then it fired. The German armor-piercing round struck Morrison's gun shield directly. The shield was designed to stop small arms fire and shell fragments. It was not designed to stop a 75mm armor-piercing projectile traveling at 3,000 feet per second. The round penetrated the shield, passed through Morrison, killed the loader standing behind him, and continued through the ammunition storage area. The resulting explosion scattered metal fragments across a 40-yard radius. Morrison and 4 crew members died instantly. 1 man survived with severe burns and shrapnel wounds. The gun was destroyed completely. Incident 2 occurred on December 18, 1944, at Trois Ponts. Lieutenant William Harper commanded a 3-gun section positioned in an ideal ambush site. Harper was a West Point graduate, class of 1943. He'd studied armor tactics under officers who'd fought in North Africa. He knew how to set up an anti-tank position. His guns were spaced 30 yards apart with overlapping fields of fire. He had clear sight lines covering 600 yards of road. The position was textbook perfect. At 0940 hours, 3 Panthers advanced down the road in column formation. Harper held fire until they reached the kill zone. When the lead Panther passed a predetermined marker at 400 yards, Harper's first gun fired. Side shot, perpendicular to the armor. The round penetrated the Panther's sponson behind the drive sprocket. Catastrophic penetration. The tank stopped, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. 1 kill. Harper's second gun engaged the middle Panther. Another side shot at 380 yards. Another penetration. The tank's ammunition detonated. The turret lifted 6 inches and fell back. 2 kills in 15 seconds. Doctrine working perfectly. But the third Panther reacted faster than Harper expected. The tank commander pivoted his vehicle 90 degrees, presenting frontal aspect to all 3 American guns. The Panther was now facing Harper's position directly at 350 yards. No side shot available. Only frontal engagement possible. All 3 of Harper's guns fired within 2 seconds of each other. 3 armor-piercing rounds, 3 different impact points on the Panther's frontal armor. All 3 rounds ricocheted. The sparks were visible even in daylight. The Panther was completely undamaged. The German tank began advancing while firing. The first round destroyed Harper's leftmost gun. The second round destroyed the center gun. Harper's third gun crew abandoned their position and retreated through the woods. The Panther continued advancing. German infantry following behind the armor overran Harper's position within 6 minutes. 11 American casualties. 2 guns destroyed, 1 captured intact. Incident 3 occurred on December 19, 1944, at Stavelot. Captain Richard Foster commanded 4 M157mm guns defending a critical road junction. Foster was 41 years old, had served in the First World War as an infantry lieutenant. He understood defensive tactics. His 4-gun line was positioned with textbook spacing at a natural choke point where the road narrowed between 2 buildings. Every field of fire had been precisely measured. Range stakes marked 200-yard intervals out to 800 yards. At 1,315 hours, 5 Panthers attacked frontally in column. They advanced slowly, methodically. The lead tank fired high-explosive rounds at suspected American positions, while the following tanks provided overwatch. German infantry advanced on both flanks under covering fire. Foster's guns opened fire at 500 yards. Standard engagement range. All 4 guns firing, staggered to maintain continuous fire. The first volley, 4 rounds, 0 penetrations. The second volley, 4 rounds, 0 penetrations. The third volley, 3 rounds, 1 gun, reloading, 0 penetrations. The Panthers continued advancing through the fire. They were taking hits. The impacts were visible, but none of the rounds penetrated. 14 rounds fired, 14 ricochets, 0 effect. At 300 yards, the Panthers began returning fire with their main guns. The first American gun was destroyed by a direct hit. The second gun took a near miss that killed 2 crew members and damaged the traversing mechanism. Captain Foster ordered the remaining 2 guns to retreat. 1 gun successfully withdrew. The other was destroyed by a follow-up shot while limbering up to move. Foster's after-action report was filed on December 20th. It contained 1 sentence that summarized the entire problem. Standard doctrine is insufficient against frontal Panther armor at any practical engagement range. The M157mm anti-tank gun represented the best American anti-armor technology available to airborne units in December 1944. It could be broken down for air transport, reassembled in minutes, and moved by a 6-man crew. But it had one fatal limitation: insufficient penetration against German heavy armor. Technical specifications of the M157mm gun. The barrel measured 50 calibers in length 114 inches from breech to muzzle. When firing the M86 armor-piercing round, muzzle velocity reached 2,800 feet per second. At 500 yards range, striking armor at a perfect 90-degree angle, the M86 round could penetrate 73 millimeters of homogeneous steel plate. The complete weapon system weighed 2,810 pounds in combat-ready configuration. The crew consisted of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, and 2 ammunition handlers. Rate of fire, 12 rounds per minute with a trained crew. Those numbers looked adequate on paper. Against most German armor from 1,942 and 1,943, the M1 was effective. It could penetrate Panzer IV tanks. It could destroy Stug 3 assault guns. It worked well in North Africa and Italy. But the Ardennes, in December 1944, wasn't North Africa. The Germans weren't using Panzer IVs anymore. Technical specifications of the Panther OSF G tank. The Panther represented Germany's answer to Soviet T-34 tanks encountered on the Eastern Front. Its frontal armor measured 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees from vertical. That slope was critical. It didn't just make the armor thicker, it changed how projectiles interacted with the steel. The effective thickness of sloped armor equals the actual thickness divided by the cosine of the angle. At 55 degrees, 80 millimeters became effectively 140 millimeters against a round striking horizontally. But there was a weakness. The upper glacis plate, where the frontal armor curved to meet the turret ring, measured only 16 millimeters thick. This thin plate was necessary to allow turret traverse and provide access to internal components. German engineers knew it, was vulnerable, but they assumed enemy guns wouldn't be able to hit such a small, steeply angled target in combat conditions. The lower glacis, the armor below the main frontal plate, measured 60 millimeters at 55 degrees of slope. Effective thickness, 105 millimeters. The main gun was a 75mm KWK 42 litres. 70. One of the most powerful tank guns in the world in 1944. Combat weight of the complete vehicle, 45 tons. The mathematical impossibility. When an M157mm round fired at standard doctrine elevation struck a Panther's frontal armor, the impact angle was approximately 15 to 20 degrees from horizontal. At that shallow angle, the effective armor thickness increased dramatically. The 80mm frontal plate became effectively 180 to 200mm thick due to the compound effect of the armor's natural slope plus the projectile's shallow approach angle. Required penetration, 200mm. Available penetration, 73mm at optimal conditions. Shortfall, 127mm. No amount of crew skill or courage could overcome that mathematical deficit. Army Ordnance collected data from combat engagements throughout January 1945. After analyzing 247 reported engagements between M157mm guns and Panther tanks, they calculated a ricochet rate of 94% for rounds fired at standard elevation against frontal armor. 94% of shots failed to penetrate. Only 6% of rounds achieved penetration, and most of those were attributed to impacts on already damaged armor sections, weak welds, or extreme close-range shots under 150 yards, where multiple rounds struck the same impact point. The M157mm gun simply could not kill a Panther tank from the front. Not at 800 yards. Not at 500 yards. Not at 300 yards. The math didn't work. Field Manual 6 to 75, December 1944 edition, was the authoritative tactical guide for American anti-tank artillery. Chapter 4, Section 3 addressed Engagement of Armored Vehicles. The manual prescribed specific procedures, developed from combat experience in North Africa, Italy, and France. Those procedures were based on fighting Panzer III, Panzer IV, and Tiger IV tanks. They worked well against those targets. Elevation for direct fire. 0 to 5 degrees. This created a flat trajectory that maximized the chance of hitting the target and minimized the possibility of the round sailing over the tank. Prescribed engagement range, 400 to 800 yards. This distance allowed the gun crew to engage before enemy tanks came within effective range of their main guns, while still maintaining reasonable accuracy. Target priority. Side armor first, rear armor second, track and suspension third. Frontal engagements were to be avoided whenever tactically possible. The manual contained one explicit prohibition that every gun commander memorized. Maximum elevation, 15 degrees, is reserved for indirect fire missions only. Direct fire at maximum elevation will result in trajectory overshoot and ineffective engagement. Gun commanders are prohibited from exceeding 5 degrees elevation during direct fire anti-armor operations. That prohibition existed for good reasons. At maximum elevation, the trajectory curved significantly. The round would arc upward, peak, then descend. At long range, this could cause the shell to overshoot the target completely. At medium range, the descending round might strike at such an acute downward angle that it would ricochet off sloped armor. The manual writers, working with data from 1942 and 1943 combat, concluded that maximum elevation was tactically unsound for anti-tank work. But the reality in the Ardennes was different. Panthers attacked frontally because the terrain channeled them into frontal approaches. The forests, hills, and narrow roads of Belgium didn't allow for the sweeping, flanking maneuvers that worked in North Africa's deserts. Poor visibility from fog, snow, and forest canopy meant gun crews often didn't see enemy armor until it was already close 200 to 600 yards too close to maneuver for side shots. Engagement ranges were dictated by terrain, not choice. American gunners couldn't wait for ideal 800-yard engagements. By the time tanks were visible, they were often already within 400 yards. And while following doctrine, American gunners were dying. 3 to 4 gun crews per day in the 82nd Airborne Division alone. Similar casualty rates in the 101st Airborne and attached armor units. Officers requested guidance from division artillery commands. They filed after-action reports explaining that current doctrine was ineffective. The response was consistent: continue standard procedures, await arrival of M36 tank destroyers with 90mm guns. But M36 tank destroyers were 80 miles away on December 20th, stuck in traffic jams on snow-blocked roads clogged with retreating units, advancing reinforcements, and refugee civilians. The M36S wouldn't arrive for 3 more days. Until then, gun crews had 2 choices: follow doctrine and die, or find another way. Karl Hübner chose another way. Karl Joseph Hübner was born on April 12, 1918, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Heinrich and Martha Hübner. Heinrich had immigrated from Germany in 1905, before the First World War complicated everything for German Americans. He found work at Jones and Laughlin Steel Company on the South Side, one of the largest steel producers in America. Heinrich worked the blast furnaces for 33 years. He came home every evening covered in soot and metal dust, smelling like coal smoke and hot iron. Karl grew up in a neighborhood where every father worked steel. The mills dominated Pittsburgh's economy. They dominated the skyline. They dominated conversations at dinner tables and in church basements. Steel was what Pittsburgh did. Steel was what Pittsburgh men knew. Karl started at Jones and Laughlin in 1934 at age 16. The Depression was grinding through its 5th year. High school could wait. His family needed the income. He was assigned to the drop forge department, where large hammers shaped hot metal into specific forms through repeated impacts. The work was brutal 12-hour shifts in 110-degree heat, handling steel that glowed orange and could burn through leather gloves in seconds. But the drop forge department taught Karl something that most men never learned: how metal behaves under stress. He learned that steel isn't uniform. Temperature changes its properties. Impact angle changes penetration depth. Thickness alone doesn't determine strength, geometry matters more. A thick, flat plate can fail where a thin, sloped plate succeeds, purely because of angles. By 1939, Karl had moved to the armor plate testing division. Jones and Laughlin had contracts with the U.S. Navy to produce armor for warships. Every plate had to be tested before shipment. The testing protocol involved firing projectiles at armor samples mounted at various angles. Karl operated the measurement equipment that recorded impact angles, penetration depths, and failure modes. For 5 years, Karl watched steel plates defeat projectiles or fail against them. He learned to predict penetration based on impact geometry. He understood that perpendicular strikes penetrated best. He knew that sloped armor derived its strength from deflecting projectiles at shallow angles. And he knew something that apparently the authors of Field Manual 6-75 didn't know. Change the angle of attack, and you change everything. This wasn't theoretical knowledge from textbooks. This was tactile understanding from handling broken armor samples and measuring failure points. Karl had held steel plates that looked undamaged on one side, but had catastrophic fractures on the other, because a projectile hit at exactly the right angle to propagate cracks through the crystalline structure. He'd seen 3-inch armor defeated by projectiles that should have bounced off simply because the impact geometry was optimal. Karl's military service began in October 1942. The draft notice arrived on a Tuesday. He reported to the induction center in downtown Pittsburgh on October 15th. The Army needed men. The Army especially needed men who could handle technical equipment. Karl's background in steel manufacturing and testing equipment made him a natural fit for artillery. Basic training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, lasted 8 weeks. Then artillery school at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Karl excelled at gunnery. The calculations came naturally to him: range estimation, trajectory prediction, elevation adjustments. He understood the physics intuitively because he'd spent 5 years watching projectiles impact targets. During qualification testing, Karl scored 98 out of 100, only 2 misses across multiple firing exercises. His instructors noted that he had an unusual tendency to question doctrine. Not in an insubordinate way, but in a genuinely curious way. Why was maximum elevation prohibited for? Direct fire? Had anyone tested it at close range? What were the actual trajectory characteristics under 300 yards? The instructors didn't have good answers. The doctrine said what it said. That was enough for most soldiers. But Karl kept thinking about it. Kept running calculations in the notebooks he'd brought from Pittsburgh. The same notebooks where he'd recorded thousands of armor test results. He was assigned to the 319th Glider Field Artillery Battalion in March 1943. The 319th supported the 82nd Airborne Division. Their weapons were designed to be air-portable, light enough to fit in gliders, robust enough to survive crash landings, powerful enough to kill tanks. The M157mm gun fit those requirements perfectly. Karl was promoted to corporal in August 1943, sergeant in February 1944, and staff sergeant in June 1944. By September 1944, he was a gun commander with his own crew. He arrived in Europe via England, landing in France on September 19th as part of Operation Market, Ardennes follow-on forces. Between September 19th and December 16th, Karl participated in 73 days of combat operations. His gun crew engaged German armor on 14 separate occasions. They achieved 3 confirmed kills, 2 SDKFZ, 234 armored cars, and 1 Stooge 3 assault gun. All 3 kills were side shots, executed per doctrine, at ranges between 400 and 600 yards. The doctrine worked perfectly against those targets. But Karl noticed something during those engagements. The Stooge 3 had frontal armor similar to a Panther 80mm sloped at 50 degrees. When Karl's gun engaged it frontally at 500 yards, the round ricocheted. The Stooge survived the first shot and began retreating. Only when it turned to maneuver away did Karl get the side shot that killed it. If that Stooge had advanced instead of retreating, Karl's crew would have died. He wrote about this in his notebook on September 24, 1944. Frontal engagement against sloped armor fails at all ranges. Side armor, vulnerable but requires enemy cooperation. Need different approach for frontal engagement. Maximum elevation? Test at close range. That was nearly 3 months before the Bulge. 3 months before Werbermont. Karl had been thinking about this problem since September. He just hadn't had the opportunity to test his theory, or the desperation to violate doctrine. December 16th, 1944, provided both the opportunity and the desperation. December 18th, 1944, 1,420 hours, near Trois Ponts. Karl Hübner's gun section was positioned in reserve, 400 yards behind Lieutenant Harper's 3 forward guns. They'd been ordered to hold in reserve as a mobile response force. If Harper's ambush failed, Hübner's section would cover the retreat. Karl stood next to his gun with binoculars pressed to his face, watching Harper's engagement unfold. The cold made his hands stiff. The binocular rubber eye cups were frozen and uncomfortable against his skin, but he kept watching because watching was how you learned to survive. Through the binoculars, he saw 3 Panthers advancing down the road in column formation at 1,421 hours. He watched Harper's first gunfire and hit the lead Panther from the side. Clean penetration. The Panther stopped, smoking. Good kill. Doctrine working. He watched the second gun fire and destroy the middle Panther the same way. Another side penetration. 2 kills in quick succession. Textbook engagement. Then the third Panther pivoted. Karl watched the tank rotate 90 degrees with surprising speed for a 45-ton vehicle. The turret stayed fixed on its target while the hull rotated beneath it. Within 3 seconds, the Panther presented frontal aspect to all 3 American guns. No side armor visible, only the sloped glacis plates. Karl knew what would happen next. He'd seen it before, But he kept watching because the range was closer than his previous observations, only 350 yards, and the light was better. Clear winter afternoon, no fog. Good. Visibility. Harper's leftmost gun fired first at 1,423 hours. Carl tracked the tracer. He saw the bright spark where the M86 armor-piercing round struck the Panther's lower glacis. The impact point was clearly visible. Then, the round tumbled away, deflected upward and to the right. Ricochet. No penetration. But Carl wasn't looking at the impact point anymore. He was looking at the Panther's entire hull, and he saw something he'd never noticed before in the chaos of combat. When the Panther fired its 75mm main gun in response, the recoil was enormous. The entire 45-ton tank rocked backward. But more importantly, the front of the tank dipped. The suspension compressed under the recoil forces, and the bow of the tank dropped approximately 8 to 10 inches. The motion lasted about 2 seconds, the time it took for the suspension to compress, absorb the recoil energy, and rebound. During those 2 seconds, the front of the Panther changed geometry. The upper glacis plate, normally protected by a 55-degree slope, became more horizontal. The plate that curved to meet the turret ring became visible from a direct front perspective. That thin 16mm plate that was normally protected by angle and position suddenly became exposed. Carl lowered his binoculars. His mind was already calculating. He pulled out his steel mill notebook, a small brown book with graph paper that he'd carried since Pittsburgh. The pages were worn and dirty. Some had dried mud on them, but the pencil calculations were still legible. He sketched quickly. First, the Panther's profile at rest. He drew the sloped glacis plate at 55 degrees. Then he drew the Panther during recoil, with the front suspension compressed and the bow dropped. The upper glacis angle changed to approximately 35 to 40 degrees. The thin plate at the turret ring became more exposed. Carl knew from his armor testing experience that thinner armor at a less acute angle was vulnerable. The 16mm plate at 40 degrees was far weaker than the 80mm plate at 55 degrees. But could his gun hit it? He ran the numbers. If he elevated his gun barrel to maximum 15 degrees and fired at close range, the trajectory would arc upward and then descend at a steep angle. At 250 to 300 yards, the round would be descending at approximately 45 to 55 degrees from horizontal when it reached the target. If timed correctly, if fired during the moment when the Panther's recoil dip exposed the thin upper plate, the round would strike nearly perpendicular to that 16mm armor. Perpendicular impact on 16mm steel. Carl had tested similar scenarios hundreds of times in Pittsburgh. The M86 round could penetrate 73mm at perpendicular impact. Against 16mm, it would punch through completely and continue into the crew compartment with enough residual energy to cause catastrophic damage. But the timing window was tiny, less than 2 seconds. The gun had to fire after the Panther fired, during the recoil dip, before the suspension, rebounded. Too early, and the round would strike the main glacis and ricochet. Too late, and the recoil window would close. Carl watched Harper's engagement continue. He watched 2 more American rounds ricochet off the Panther's frontal armor. He watched the Panther advance while firing. He watched Harper's guns get destroyed one by one. And he watched the Panther's recoil dip happen every single time it fired. Consistent, predictable, exploitable. At 1,427 hours, the engagement ended. Harper's position was overrun. 11 casualties. 2 guns destroyed, 1 captured. The Panther survived without serious damage. Standard doctrine had failed again, but Carl Hübner had seen something that changed everything. He'd seen a weakness, a momentary vulnerability that existed for exactly 1.8 to 2.2 seconds after each shot. A geometric window where thin armor became exposed, and a steep trajectory round could achieve perpendicular impact. He'd seen how to kill a Panther from the front. The trick, the question was whether he could convince anyone to let him try. That evening, December 18th, 1944, The temperature dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Karl Hübner sat in a foxhole shared with his platoon leader, Lieutenant David Kowalski. They'd scraped the hole out of frozen ground 3 days earlier, lined it with pine branches, and covered it with a shelter half. It kept the wind off but did nothing for the cold. Both men wore every layer they owned. Their breath hung in the air like smoke. Kowalski was cleaning his M1 carbine by candlelight. The flame flickered in the cold air, casting shadows across his face. He was 24 years old, commissioned through Officer Candidate School, after serving as an enlisted mortarman in North Africa. He'd been with the 319th for 7 months. He'd lost 9 men in that time, 3 to artillery, 2 to small arms fire, 4 to German armor. Karl had his notebook open, showing Kowalski the sketches from that afternoon. The Panther at rest. The Panther during recoil. The trajectory calculations. The angle measurements. Kowalski studied the drawings without speaking for nearly a minute. "Sir, I think I can kill panthers frontally," Karl said. Kowalski looked up from the notebook. "Explain." Karl walked him through the observation. The recoil dip, the exposed upper glacis, the timing window, the need for maximum elevation to create a plunging trajectory that would strike the thin armor perpendicularly. He spoke quietly, methodically, the way he'd explained armor test results to engineers at Jones and Laughlin. When Karl finished, Kowalski reached into his field jacket and pulled out a folded copy of Field Manual 6-75. The pages were worn from use and stained with mud. He opened it to Chapter 4, Section 3, and read aloud by candlelight. Maximum elevation, 15 degrees, is reserved for indirect fire missions only. Direct fire at maximum elevation will result in trajectory overshoot and ineffective engagement. Gun commanders are prohibited from exceeding 5 degrees elevation during direct fire anti-armor operations. Kowalski looked at Karl. "That's not a suggestion. That's a direct order embedded in field manual doctrine. You're talking about violating it." "Yes, sir. If you're wrong, you'll miss the target completely. The round will sail over the Panther and hit nothing. We'll have wasted ammunition and exposed our position." "Yes, sir. If you're wrong and it gets your crew killed, I'll have to write letters to 4 families explaining that their sons died because their gun commander violated doctrine based on a theory about recoil timing." "Sir." Kowalski closed the manual. He stared at the candle flame. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. 15. 20. "The manual was written before anyone fought panthers in the Ardennes," Karl said. "The engineers who wrote those elevation restrictions were thinking about fighting Panzer IVs in North Africa at 800 yards. They weren't thinking about close range, engagements in fog and forest against sloped heavy armor. That may be true, but doctrine exists for reasons. So do the 23 guns we've lost in 6 days. That hit Kowalski hard. Karl could see it in his face. The lieutenant had written 7 of those loss reports himself. He'd attended 2 funerals. He'd inventoried personal effects for shipping home. He'd told Harper's crew to set up that ambush position at Trois Ponts. He'd watched Harper die following doctrine. At 500 yards, standard doctrine gives us 0 chance of frontal penetration, Karl continued. The math doesn't work. We've proven that statistically. 94% ricochet rate. So, standard doctrine means we either get side shots or we die. But in this terrain, we're not getting side shots. Panthers attack frontally because the roads force them to. So right now, doctrine means death. Kowalski picked up the notebook again. Studied the trajectory calculations. You worked in a steel mill before the war. Armor plate testing. 5 years. And you think that qualifies you to rewrite Army doctrine? I think it qualifies me to understand how projectiles penetrate sloped armor, which is more than whoever wrote that manual understood about panthers, because panthers didn't exist when they wrote it. Kowalski sat back against the frozen dirt wall of the foxhole. He was quiet for a long time. Karl didn't push. He'd made his argument. Now it was up to the lieutenant to decide whether doctrine or survival mattered more. How certain are you about the timing window? Kowalski finally asked. I watched the Panther fire 4 times this afternoon. The recoil dip happened every time. Duration was consistent. Between 1.8 and 2.2 seconds based on my count. That's enough time to fire if the gun is already laid on target. And the trajectory? You're certain about the impact angle. At 250 yards with maximum elevation, the round will be descending at approximately 50 degrees when it reaches the target. Combined with the recoil dip exposing the upper glacis, impact angle will be close to perpendicular. Close enough to penetrate 16 mm armor. Close enough isn't certain. No, sir. But it's better odds than standard doctrine gives us against frontal armor. Kowalski was silent again. Karl could hear distant artillery. American guns, probably. The Germans had been quiet since afternoon. The cold was killing both armies. Frostbite and ammunition shortages were becoming bigger problems than enemy action. Give me one engagement, Karl said. If we get into contact and you think I have the shot, let me take it. If it fails, you can court-martial me for violating doctrine. I'll testify that I acted without orders. But if it works, you'll have killed a Panther from the front using a gun that's not supposed to be able to do that. Yes, sir. Kowalski folded the field manual and put it back in his jacket. He looked at Karl for a long moment. Young lieutenant, experienced sergeant, officer with doctrine training, enlisted man with practical knowledge. Command authority versus field expertise. The eternal tension in every army. Here's what's going to happen, Kowalski said. If we get engaged and you believe you have an optimal shot using your method, you will take that shot. I will not explicitly order you to violate doctrine. I will not explicitly authorize maximum elevation. But I will also not prevent you from executing your best tactical judgment in combat. Understood, sir. If it works, I will back you when division asks questions. And they will ask questions. If it fails and we survive, I will testify that you acted without my knowledge or consent. You'll face charges. Yes, sir. And if it fails and we don't survive, none of this conversation matters anyway. No, sir. Kowalski blew out the candle. The foxhole went dark except for ambient starlight reflecting off snow. Get your crew ready. If we're doing this, they need to. Know what you're planning. I'll brief them tonight. Hubner? Sir? Harper was my friend. We went through OCS together. I recommended him for that ambush position. I told him to set up exactly where he did. Karl said nothing. There was nothing to say. Don't make me write another letter, Kowalski said. If you're going to violate doctrine, make damn sure it works. I will, sir. At 2,130 hours, Karl gathered his 4-man gun crew in their position. The gun sat under camouflage netting, barrel pointed northwest toward the road junction. Frost coated the metal. Snow was starting to fall, light flurries that caught in the moonlight. Corporal James Decker arrived first. He was the loader, 22 years old. From Akron, Ohio. His father manufactured tires for Goodyear before the war, made artillery shells during it. Decker had loaded more than 300 rounds in combat. He knew the gun's rhythm, the precise moment to slam the breech closed, the exact position to stand to avoid, recoil, the quickest path to reach the next round. He was efficient, fast, reliable. Private First Class, Robert Chen came next. Ammunition handler, 20 years old, from Sacramento, California. His parents ran a grocery store until Executive Order 9066 sent them to Tule Lake Internment Camp. Chen had been at basic training when it happened. The Army let him stay because they needed bodies. His older brother had been in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, killed at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. Chen never talked about his brother except once, when he'd told Karl the story while digging a gun position. His brother had died following doctrine too, following orders to hold a position that couldn't be held. Private First Class Michael O'Brien was the second ammunition handler, 19 years old, from South Boston. Irish Catholic, 6 brothers, Father worked the docks. O'Brien had joined straight out of high school in 1943. He'd been in Europe for 4 months, still young enough to think. Combat was something you could understand, still green enough to trust that doctrine meant safety. Private Thomas White was the assistant gunner, 21 years old, from rural Georgia. White was quiet, competent, mechanical. He understood the gun's mechanisms better than anyone except Carl. He could break down and reassemble the traversing mechanism in darkness. He knew which sounds meant the elevation wheel needed lubrication and which sounds meant something was about to break. Carl had them sit in a circle in the snow. He drew diagrams with a stick, scratching lines in the white surface by moonlight. "I need to brief you on a new tactic," Carl began. "Something that violates Field Manual 6 to 75. Something that could get us court-martialed if it fails." Decker spoke first. "You're talking about maximum elevation. How did you know?" "I've seen you looking at the elevation wheel during engagements, seen you checking the angle, figured you were planning something." Carl nodded. He drew a Panther profile in the snow. Then he drew the recoil dip. Then he drew the trajectory arc of a round fired at maximum elevation. When a Panther fires, the recoil pushes the front suspension down for about 2 seconds. During that time, the upper glacis plate right here, thin armor at the turret ring junction, becomes exposed. If we fire at maximum elevation at close range, the round will arc up and come down steep. It'll hit that thin plate almost perpendicular during the recoil window. O'Brien stared at the diagram. "You're saying we aim at the sky and hope physics works?" "No. I'm saying we aim at the upper plate and time our shot for the recoil window. We wait for the Panther to fire first. Count 1001, 1002. Then we fire during the dip." "And if you miss the timing?" Decker asked. "If we fire too early, we hit the main glacis and ricochet like standard doctrine. If we fire too late, the window closes and we hit the main glacis and ricochet. Either way, we're no worse off than following doctrine. But if the timing is right, we kill the Panther." Chen had been silent, listening. Now he spoke. "What does the manual say about this?" "Manual says, don't do it. Maximum elevation is prohibited for direct fire. And we're doing it anyway. We're doing it if we get the chance, and if Lieutenant Kowalski doesn't stop us." Chen nodded slowly. His face was unreadable in the moonlight. Then he said, "My brother died at Kasserine following doctrine. Officers told him to hold a ridge against German armor. He held it. Doctrine said, 'Hold your position.' So he held it. Panthers rolled over his position and killed everyone." The group was quiet. "I'm in," Chen said. O'Brien shifted in the snow. He was the youngest, the least experienced. "How do we know the shell won't just sail over the tank?" "At maximum elevation, that's a high arc. What if we overshoot?" "At 250 yards, the trajectory peaks at about 35 feet, Carl explained. "The round descends from there at a steep angle. A Panther is 10 feet tall. The math gives us about 8 feet of margin for error in elevation. Not much, but enough if we range correctly." "You sure about the math?" "I calculated armor angles for 3 years in Pittsburgh. I'm sure." O'Brien looked at the diagram in the snow, looked at the gun sitting under its camouflage net, looked back at Carl. "Okay. But if this gets us killed, I'm haunting you." White hadn't spoken yet. He'd been studying the gun while the others talked. Now he stood and walked to the elevation mechanism. He spun the wheel slowly, counting rotations. The barrel elevated smoothly, rising from 0 degrees to maximum. White checked the mechanism's movement, tested for binding or resistance, examined the gears. "Mechanism works," White said. 12 full rotations from 0 to 15 degrees. Takes about 5 seconds if you move fast, 4 seconds if you don't care about being gentle." "We'll need 4 seconds, Carl said. "Maybe less." White walked back to the group. "How do we practice the timing? Can't exactly ask the Germans to shoot at us for training purposes. We don't practice. We execute on first attempt." Decker. How fast can you load? 4 seconds from breech open to breech closed. 3 seconds if the round is already in my hands. Chen. O'Brien. How fast can you hand ammunition? Chen answered. 2 seconds per round if we're positioned right. We can keep 6 rounds within arm's reach. So, after the first shot, we can fire again in 6 seconds. That's critical. If the first shot fails, we might get a second chance if the Panther stops to identify our position. And if the Panther doesn't stop? O'Brien asked. Then we're back to standard doctrine and hope for side shots. The crew was silent. Carl let them process. He knew what he was asking. He was asking them to trust calculations from a steel mill worker against doctrine written by army professionals. He was asking them to violate explicit orders. He was asking them to risk court-martial, injury, death. But he was also offering them something they hadn't had in 6 days. A chance to kill Panthers frontally. A chance to stop running. A chance to fight back against armor that had been slaughtering American gun crews with impunity. Decker spoke first. If we get the shot, I'll load as fast as I've ever loaded. You call it, I'll have the round ready. White nodded. I'll handle elevation. 4 seconds to maximum. Chen and O'Brien looked at each other, then nodded together. We're in, Chen said. All of us. Carl looked at his crew. 4 men who'd just agreed to bet their lives on geometry and timing. 4 men who trusted him enough to violate doctrine. Get some sleep, Carl said. Tomorrow we might make history, or we might get court-martialed. Either way, we'll need rest. The crew dispersed to their foxholes. Carl stayed by the gun, one hand on the cold metal barrel, looking northwest toward where the Panthers would come. 2 days later, they would come. December 20th, 1944, 0630 hours. The sky was still dark when Lieutenant Kowalski roused the gun crews. The temperature had dropped overnight to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice crystals had formed on every metal surface. Carl's breath condensed in thick clouds as he moved to his gun position. 4 157mm guns were positioned at the Werbermont crossroads. The intersection controlled 3 roads, one running north toward Stoumont and the German advance routes, one running east toward Trois-Ponts, one running south toward the American fallback positions. Open fields stretched north and east, providing clear fields of fire. Forest pressed close on the west side. The snow was 8 inches deep, frozen hard enough to walk on without breaking through. Gunhashone was Carl's position, 40 yards left of the crossroads proper. He'd chosen the spot 2 days earlier based on sight lines and cover. A low stone wall provided minimal protection. Pine trees behind the position offered concealment from aerial observation. Range to the northern road, 800 yards at the tree line, 400 yards at the near fence, 200 yards at the intersection itself. Gun #2, commanded by Sergeant Frank Morrison, sat at the crossroads center. Morrison was 33, regular army, had been with the 319th since its formation. He was competent, steady, traditional. He followed doctrine precisely because doctrine had kept him alive through 3 campaigns. His gun position had the best field of fire, could cover all 3 roads simultaneously. Gun #3, commanded by Sergeant William Carter, was positioned 35 yards right of the crossroads. Carter was 29, National Guard, from Pennsylvania like Carl. They'd talked about Pittsburgh steel mills once. Carter's uncle had worked at Bethlehem Steel. He understood manufacturing, understood tolerances and specifications. He was practical, pragmatic, willing to adapt if circumstances required it. Gun #4, commanded by Sergeant Edward Lopez, sat 80 yards behind the others in reserve. Lopez was 26, from Texas, had worked on his family's ranch before the war. He knew animals, knew how predators moved and hunted. He'd once told Carl that tank tactics reminded him of watching coyotes hunt cattle, probe for weakness, strike the vulnerable, retreat if the target fights back. Lopez was smart, observant, patient. The 4 guns created overlapping fields of fire covering a frontage of 115 yards. Each crew had 60 rounds of M86 armor-piercing ammunition. Each gun had been test-fired the previous afternoon to verify mechanical function. Each crew had ranged landmarks throughout their sector fences, tree lines, road junctions, anything that could serve as a reference point for distance estimation. At 06:15 hours, the intelligence report came through on the radio. Lieutenant Kowalski copied it down in his log. German armored column spotted Stumont. 05:45 hours. Composition: 8 to 12 Panther tanks. Infantry support estimated 1 company, 40 to 60 men. Direction of movement: south toward Werbermont. Estimated arrival time: 0830 to 0900 hours. American reinforcements: none available within 4 hours. Orders: delay enemy advance minimum 30 minutes to allow fallback position establishment 2 miles south. Kowalski read the report aloud to the assembled gun commanders. 30 minutes. That was the mission. Hold for 30 minutes against 8 to 12 Panthers and a company of infantry. Then retreat if still alive. Karl did the math silently. 4 guns against 8 to 12 Panthers. Optimistically, 3 to 1 odds against. Realistically, worse. Panthers had 80 mm frontal armor. M157 mm guns could not penetrate that armor using standard doctrine. The mission parameters assumed the guns would be destroyed but would buy time through their sacrifice. Kowalski looked at each gun commander in turn. Standard doctrine, until otherwise directed. Engage at 400 yards. Side shots when possible. If forced to engage frontally, aim for tracks and suspension. Disable mobility. Then Kowalski looked directly at Karl. Gun commanders have discretion to employ alternative tactics if standard engagement proves ineffective. That was as close to authorization as Karl would get. Alternative tactics. Discretion. Kowalski had given him permission without explicitly ordering anything that would appear in an after-action report. Questions? Kowalski asked. Morrison spoke. What's our fallback signal, sir? 3 red flares. When you see 3 red flares, limber up and retreat south. Route is marked. Rally point is 2 miles back at the farmhouse. What if we can't limber up? Carter asked. Spike the guns and retreat on foot. Don't die trying to save equipment. The commanders dispersed to their positions. Karl walked back to Gunhershon, where his crew waited. Decker, Chen, O'Brien, White. 4 men who'd agreed to trust his calculations. Morning, Sergeant, Decker said. Heard. The intelligence report. 12 Panthers. 8 to 12, Karl corrected. Might be fewer. Still, bad odds. Yes. The crew prepared the position. Chen and O'Brien arranged ammunition 6 rounds immediately accessible on a canvas tarp, 12 more in wooden crates within 10 feet. The remaining 42 stacked behind the stone wall. White checked the elevation and traversing mechanisms, applied lubricant to moving parts, verified that both wheels turned smoothly. Decker test-loaded a dummy round, practicing the motion until he could do it in darkness. Karl ranged the sector again using binoculars. The northern road was barely visible through morning fog. Visibility: approximately 800 yards. Not ideal, but workable. He marked landmarks in his notebook. Tree line, 780 yards. Fence junction, 620 yards. Road bend, 410 yards. Near fence, 240 yards. Crossroads, 180 yards. If Panthers approached, those landmarks would help him estimate range without revealing the position by using port, range-finding equipment. At 0730 hours, the sun began rising. The fog thickened as temperature differentials increased. Visibility dropped to 600 yards, then 400 yards. Karl couldn't see the tree line anymore. He could barely see the fence junction. This was both advantage and disadvantage. The fog would conceal American positions, but it would also reduce engagement range. The guns would be fighting at close range, exactly the conditions where Karl's maximum elevation tactic would work best. But it also meant less warning time, less opportunity to prepare. At 0820 hours, a runner arrived from battalion. Young, private, probably 18, breath coming in gasps. He'd run 2 miles through snow. "Sir," the private gasped at Kowalski. "Battalion says German column is 3 miles out, moving faster than expected. ETA revised to 0845 hours, 15 minutes earlier than estimated." Karl checked his watch. 0821 hours. 24 minutes until contact. Maybe less if the Germans maintained their pace. Kowalski sent the runner back with acknowledgement, then keyed his radio. All guns. Enemy contact expected 0845 hours. Maintain position. Hold fire until my command. Karl relayed the warning to his crew. 24 minutes. Check everything one more time. White spun the elevation wheel through its full range. Smooth operation. Decker cycled the breech mechanism. Clean action. Chen and O'Brien recounted ammunition. 60 rounds, all accounted for.